Walk into a game shop in 1998 and something feels different immediately. The walls are lined up with dual PlayStation cases stretching further than you can take in with one glance. Some have only just arrived, others are already impossible to ignore because everyone has been talking about them for weeks. Magazine covers are plastered with review scores, cardboard standees hang from the ceiling, a television in the corner loops a track videos while somebody waits patiently for a turn at a demo kiosk. You're only planning to browse for 10 minutes, an hour later, you're still there. That was the PlayStation in 1998, not because there was one game everybody wanted, because there always seemed to be another one. Horror fans couldn't stop talking about Resident Evil 2, fighting game players crowded around Tekken 3, convinced nobody could beat their Eddie Gordo. Platform fans argued over whether Crash Bandicoot Warped or Spyro the Dragon deserved the crown. Role-playing fans disappeared into the strange worlds of Parasite Eve and Xenogears. Others found themselves cruising through cities in Driver, battling across gothic landscapes in MediEvil, or discovering games that never seemed to fit clearly into a single genre at all. Ask 10 people what defined 1998 and you'll probably hear 10 different answers. That's what makes this year so remarkable. Most legendary years are remembered for one defining release. 1998 felt like an entire shelf. Looking back now, it's easy to forget how unusual that was. For the first few years of the PlayStation, every breakthrough felt like a milestone. A new genre proving itself, a developer solving another piece of the three-dimensional puzzle. Every success answered another question about what games could become. By 1998, those questions had mostly disappeared. Developers understood the hardware, publishers understood the audience, players understood what they wanted. For the first time since Sony entered the console market, everybody seemed to be pulling in the same direction. That's why this year feels different. Not because technology suddenly kept leaping forward overnight. The PlayStation still only had 2 MB of main memory, it still suffered from texture wobble, limited draw distance and hardware compromises that engineers had been wrestling with since the launch. None of those problems magically disappeared. Developers simply became astonishingly good at hiding them. Instead of fighting the machine, they learned how to work with it. Limitations became style, loading became invisible, atmosphere replaced raw polygon counts, direction became more important than spectacle. It wasn't the console that had changed the most, it was the people making games for it. That confidence spread everywhere. Capcom returned with a sequel that somehow made survival horror feel even larger. Konami handed Hideo Kojima the freedom to build a stealth adventure unlike anything else on the market. Naughty Dog refined everything it had learned from Crash Bandicoot. Insomniac introduced an entirely new mascot to approach platforming from a completely different angle. Square, fresh from the success of Final Fantasy VII, wasn't content to repeat itself, experimenting with darker themes and ambitious new ideas that showed just how wide the role-playing genre could become. It felt as though every major studio had reached the same conclusion at exactly the same time. This was their moment. And because so many developers were hitting their stride together, the PlayStation became something it had never quite been before. A machine where almost every genre found its champion. Whether you loved horror, racing, fighting games, platforming, stealth, role-playing games or sports titles, there was a PlayStation game waiting to become your favourite. That's why conversations started changing. People weren't arguing about whether Sony belonged anymore. They weren't comparing CDs to cartridges. They weren't wondering whether three-dimensional games was the future. Those debates had already been settled. Now, the argument sounded completely different. Which Resident Evil was better? Could anybody beat King and Tekken? Crash or Spyro? Was Parasite Eve really an RPG? Was Metal Gear Solid actually a game or something entirely new? That's perhaps my favourite thing about 1998. It wasn't defined by one masterpiece, it was defined by choice. Every player remembers a different journey, a different character, a different soundtrack, a different weekend spent refusing to turn the console off because they were convinced they were only one level away from the end. Some years shape an industry, others shape memories. 1998 somehow managed to do both. And nearly 30 years later, people are still arguing about which PlayStation game deserved to be called the best. They're still making lists, still replaying them, still discovering them, because if the earlier years were about building the PlayStation, 1998 was the year it finally became something Sony hoped it could be. Welcome to the definitive year of the Sony PlayStation. By the beginning of 1998, Capcom found itself in an unusual position. The original Resident Evil had exceeded every expectation. Survival horror had gone from an experiment to one of the industry's most exciting new genres almost overnight, and a sequel wasn't just expected, it was inevitable. Players wanted another trip into the unknown, publishers wanted another hit, and somewhere inside Capcom, a team had already spent months building exactly that. Then something extraordinary happened. They stopped. The sequel was well into development, characters had been designed, environments built, and huge portions of the games were already playable. By some estimates, it was around 70% complete. Most studios would have looked at the calendar, accepted a few compromises, and sent it into manufacturing. Capcom looked at the same project and decided it wasn't good enough. Today, fans know that abandoned version as Resident Evil 1.5. It wasn't broken, it wasn't a disaster. In many ways, it already looked like a worthy follow-up, but it lacked something far harder to define. The atmosphere wasn't quite right, the characters didn't feel memorable enough, the city itself never came alive in the way the team had imagined. So they made one of the boldest decisions of the PlayStation generation. They started again. That choice says a great deal about 1998. Only a few years earlier, developers were simply trying to prove they could build convincing three-dimensional worlds at all. Now, some of the industry's biggest studios were willing to throw away months of work in pursuit of something better. The PlayStation hadn't suddenly become more powerful, the people creating games for it had simply become more ambitious. Under director Hideki Kamiya, with Shinji Mikami overseeing the project, the sequel slowly transformed into something far larger than anyone had first imagined. The action moved from a lonely mansion to an entire city collapsing under its own nightmare. New characters stepped into the spotlight. Leon S. Kennedy arrived for what would have been his first day as a police officer. Claire Redfield entered Raccoon City, searching for her missing brother, only to discover somewhere already beyond saving. Before you've even fired a shot, the city tells you everything you need to know. Police cars sit abandoned in streets, shop windows are shattered, fires burnt unchecked in the distance, while the sound of chaos fades into silence. It feels less like the beginning of a game and more like arriving after the world has already ended. Then the doors of the Raccoon Police Department open. Even now, it's one of the most memorable locations of the original PlayStation. Long corridors disappear into darkness, marble floors echo beneath your footsteps, every unopened door carries a question mark. You don't just rush through the building, you learn it, staircase by staircase, corridor by corridor, safe room by safe room. Before long, you know the police station almost as well as your own house. Capcom understood that fear wasn't created by constant action, sometimes it came from waiting. The slow creak of a door opening, the sound of something moving just beyond the camera, the relief of finding another typewriter before deciding whether to use your precious ink ribbons. Then, just when you thought you understood the rules, the game changes them again. The A and B scenarios gave Leon and Claire separate journeys that overlapped in clever ways, rewarding players who returned for a second playthrough rather than simply repeating the same adventure. Enemies appeared in different places, decisions carried unexpected consequences, Mr. X showing up unexpectedly. The world felt less like a collection of levels and more like somewhere that continued to exist whether you were there or not. The remarkable thing is that none of this came from more powerful hardware. The PlayStation inside your television was exactly the same machine people had bought years earlier. The illusion came from craftsmanship. Beautifully designed, pre-rendered backgrounds created places the console could never have rendered in real time. Camera angles weren't just technical compromises anymore, they became part of the suspense, hiding danger just beyond the edge of the screen. Loading screens designed themselves as heavy wooden doors, turning a necessary pause into one last moment of uncertainty before whatever waited on the other side. When Resident Evil 2 finally arrived, players immediately understood that Capcom's gamble had been worthwhile. Reviews were exceptional, sales exploded, word spread quickly that this wasn't simply a sequel trying to capture an old success, it was bigger, richer and more confident in almost every way. For many players, it didn't just live up to the original, it replaced it, and perhaps that's the real story of Resident Evil 2. Not that it became one of the PlayStation's greatest games, but that a studio looked at a sequel most companies would have proudly released, accepted that it wasn't the best they could do, and found the courage to begin again. That confidence wasn't unique to Capcom. In 1998, it was beginning to spread across the entire industry.
I didn't think our marriage would survive.
It was really awful. Both of us kept everything pent up until one of us would just explode.
Hey, stupid! What kind of a meal was that? You were the...
Then we discovered Tekken 3. This is for 40 years of macaroni and cheese.
That's for never saying I'm sorry.
And this is for your mother.
That's for the loser that you are, Patrick. Thank you, Tekken 3. PlayStation.
If there was one game that settled arguments without anyone saying a word, it was Tekken 3. You didn't need to read reviews, you didn't need to know how many copies it sold or whether critics thought it was the best fighting game ever made. All it took was watching somebody who actually knew what they were doing. One round was enough. A flurry of kicks, a perfectly timed sidestep, a throw you'd never seen before, the announcer declaring perfect while the loser insisted their controller wasn't working properly. Before long, the controller was changing hands and somebody else wanted the next match. That became the rhythm of Tekken 3, not finishing it, playing one more fight. By 1998, Namco wasn't trying to convince people that Tekken belonged on the PlayStation anymore. That battle had already been won years earlier. Instead, the developers set themselves a far more difficult challenge. How do you improve a series that already feels like it's reached the top of its game? The answer wasn't to reinvent it, it was to refine almost everything. The difference is obvious within seconds of picking up the controller. Movement feels lighter without losing impact. Every punch flows with satisfying weight while every kick flows naturally into the next animation. Characters don't simply move faster, they move more believably. Even players who knew nothing about frame data or fighting game mechanics could feel that something was different. The controls seemed to disappear, leaving only instinct and timing. The roster helped too, not because it was larger, but because it felt unforgettable. Jin Kazama stepped into the spotlight, carrying the weight of the Mishima family story into a new generation. Hwoarang's relentless taekwondo style demanded an entirely different approach, while Eddie Gordo introduced millions of players to capoeira, a martial art many have never seen before. For weeks afterwards, school playgrounds and living rooms were full of people attempting spinning kicks they had absolutely no chance of pulling off. Everyone seemed to have a character. Someone always chose King, somebody else refused to pick anyone except Paul Phoenix, and there was almost always one person who insisted Eddie Gordo was completely unfair. Looking back now, it's difficult to separate the game from the people who played it. Tekken 3 wasn't something you simply completed and placed back on the shelf, it became part of your routine. You learnt another combo before school, you spent an evening trying to unlock another character, you finally managed to land a move you'd been practicing for days, only for your friend to immediately discover a way around it. Every victory encouraged you to improve, every defeat quietly challenged you to come back tomorrow. Even the additions made specifically for the PlayStation reflected that change in relationship. Tekken Force gave players something entirely different between the traditional matches. While extra modes and unlockables rewarded their time rather than simply skill, it no longer felt like an arcade experience that happened to be available at home. It felt like a game that understood people would be living with it for months. Perhaps that's why its reputation has lasted so long. There are fighting games with larger rosters, more complex mechanics, bigger budgets, yet Tekken 3 still appears near the top of the conversations about the greatest fighting games ever made because it captured something remarkably difficult to achieve. It felt effortless. Every animation, every sound effect, and every impact seemed to land exactly where you'd expected, creating a rhythm that was so satisfying whether you were learning your first basic combo or mastering every move on the command list. Very few games reach that point where the mechanics become almost invisible and all that's left is the enjoyment of playing. By 1998, the PlayStation was full of ambitious games trying to become bigger. Tekken 3 took a different path, it simply became better, and sometimes that's much harder to do.
Store's closed.
Not for me, pal. You might say I'm Spyro's hot co-star. I love that little dragon. The way he blows fire at chicks like me. This is an official protest. I am an anti-Spyro activist.
Genghis, come.
What'd you say?
You're toast.
After everything else 1998 had to offer, there was something comforting about stepping into a world that simply wanted to make you smile. Not every great PlayStation game that year was filled with monsters, secret agents, or impossible martial arts. Sometimes the biggest adventure began by wandering through a peaceful hillside, listening to a soundtrack that seemed to drift gently through the air while wondering what might be beyond the next hill. Spyro the Dragon understood that feeling perfectly. The first thing you noticed wasn't the combat or the collecting, it was the space. Standing in the artisan's home world and looking out across distant castles, winds and pathways and floating islands felt strangely liberating. Earlier PlayStation games often hid what lay behind the next corner, but Spyro invited you to look into the distance. It gave the impression of a world that stretched far beyond the places you were actually exploring, and Stuart Copeland's soundtrack wrapped the whole experience in an atmosphere that felt relaxed, playful and quietly magical. It wasn't a game that hurried you, you wandered because you wanted to. You doubled back because another hidden gem might be tucked behind a wall or at the top of a cliff you hadn't noticed before. Every new world felt handcrafted, each one with its own colours, personality and gentle sense of humour. Long before people talked about games being cosy, Spyro the Dragon had already discovered how satisfying it could be to simply exist inside a world for a while. Crash Bandicoot Warp took almost the opposite approach. Where Spyro encouraged exploration, Crash demanded precision. Every jump had a rhythm, every spin attack had a purpose. Naughty Dog had spent years refining the series, and by the third game, there was an unmistakable confidence in everything it did. Levels shifted effortlessly between ancient temples, medieval castles, underwater ruins and speed and motorbike races, constantly introducing fresh ideas before moving on to the next surprise. Then there were the time trials. For many players, finishing the level was only the beginning. Suddenly, every crate mattered, every missed jump became frustrating, every second counted. The challenge wasn't simply reaching the goal anymore, it was reaching it faster than you had yesterday, shaving tiny moments from a run until muscle memory replaced every thought entirely. It was the sort of obsession that quietly stole entire evenings without you noticing. Then came MediEvil, proving that PlayStation still had room for something wonderfully strange. Where Crash was bright and energetic and Spyro was warm and inviting, MediEvil embraced crooked gravestones, haunted villages and moonlit graveyards without ever becoming truly frightening. It borrowed the language of gothic horror, but filtered it through British humour, giving players one of the most unlikely heroes on the console. Sir Daniel Fortesque wasn't a fearless warrior, he was an accident of history, a skeleton knight trying to earn the heroic reputation he never quite deserved. Somehow, that made him even more endearing. It's fitting that one of the PlayStation's most memorable heroes barely had a jaw. Looking across the library as a whole, that's what stands out most about 1998. Those worlds didn't resemble one another at all. Tomba mixed exploration with bizarre humour and unpredictable quests. Even games that never reached the same commercial success still carried their own mistakable identity, refusing to blend into the crowd. Perhaps that's why this period remains so easy to remember, not because every game looked realistic, because every game looked like itself. You could recognise a screenshot of Spyro from across a room, you knew Crash from a single animation, one glint of Sir Daniel's lopsided grin, and there was no mistaking MediEvil for anything else. In a year overflowing with technical ambition, these games quietly reminded everyone that personality mattered just as much as power. Some worlds impress you, these worlds invited you back. And while dragons, bandicoots and bumbling skeletons were giving players places they'd never forget, another developer was preparing to show that games could borrow just as much from cinema as they did from cartoons. His name was Hideo Kojima. There are games you remember because they were fun. There are games you remember because they were difficult. Then there are games you remember because they made you stop for a moment and wonder how somebody managed to create them in the first place. Metal Gear Solid belonged firmly in that last group. Long before anyone pressed start, the game already felt different. Magazine covers couldn't stop talking about it. Preview discs teased only a glimpse of what was waiting inside Shadow Moses, yet that was enough to spark endless conversations. Even though short demonstrations carried a confidence that felt unusual for the time, Guards didn't simply stand still waiting to be defeated. They followed patrol routes, they reacted to footsteps, they searched rooms after spotting movement. Suddenly, avoiding a fight seemed just as satisfying as winning one. It didn't feel like another action game. It felt like somebody had rewritten the rules. At the centre of all this was Hideo Kojima. While many developers were asking how to make bigger games, Kojima seemed fascinated by a different question. How do you make players feel like they're inside the film without taking control away from them? It wasn't just the lengthy cutscenes that made Metal Gear Solid stand apart, it was the way every part of the experience served the same vision. The opening submarine approach, the long trek through the snow, the quiet conversations over codec, even something as simple as waiting beneath a security camera became tense because the game trusted silence as much as action. Most games still rewarded speed, Metal Gear Solid rewarded patience. Instead of charging into every room with weapons drawn, players found themselves watching guard patterns, listening for footsteps and searching for another way forward. Success wasn't measured by how many enemies you defeated. Often, the greatest satisfaction came from slipping through unnoticed, leaving soldiers completely unaware you had ever been there. Then there were the moments that nobody expected. Psycho Mantis reading your memory card, the instruction to swap controller ports, the sniper duel with Sniper Wolf, climbing the communications tower under relentless gunfire, battling Metal Gear X itself. Each encounter felt designed to surprise, not simply challenge. Kojima wasn't interested in repeating the same boss fight 6 times. Every confrontation became another opportunity to play with the player's expectations. Even the smallest details carried remarkable care. Conversations over the codec revealed personalities rather than objectives. Characters discussed nuclear weapons, genetics, politics and loyalty with a seriousness that few games had attempted before. Some players loved every minute of it, others hammered the skip button, desperate to get back to the action. Either way, people talked about it afterwards, and perhaps that's what mattered the most. People talked about Metal Gear Solid, not just about beating it, about what it meant, about who was right, about whether games could really tell stories like this. The PlayStation had hosted ambitious adventures before, but Metal Gear Solid made them feel deliberate. Every camera angle, every line of dialogue and every piece of music appeared carefully placed, as though somebody had thought about exactly how each scene would make the player feel. The remarkable thing is that almost none of this happened by accident. Kojima drew heavily from films he admired, borrowing techniques from Hollywood thrillers without simply copying them. Camera framing guided the player's attention. Long silences created tension when another game might have reached for explosions. The result wasn't a film pretending to be a game, it was a game confidently using the language of cinema while remaining completely interactive. That's a much harder balance to achieve. When Metal Gear Solid launched in September 1998, it quickly became one of the PlayStation's defining releases. Critics praised its ambition, players shared stories about its unforgettable twists, and suddenly Kojima himself became almost as recognisable as the characters he had created. Developers had always mattered, but now players were beginning to follow individual creative voices in much the same way the film audiences followed directors. Looking back today, it's tempting to focus on the famous moments, the cardboard box, Psycho Mantis, the codec, the stealth, but perhaps the greatest achievement of Metal Gear Solid was much simpler than any of those. It trusted the players, it trusted them to listen, to wait, to think, to become part of the story instead of simply watching it unfold. And in doing so, it quietly expanded people's expectations of what a PlayStation game could be.
Save us! God save us! God save us! Lord, why? Tell me why!
Awake now.
God, humanity is over! Humanity!
そして DNA が繰り出す I am Eve.
God save us! God!
The cinematic RPG Parasite Eve.
Success can be a dangerous thing. When a studio creates one of the biggest games in the world, the safest decision is usually the simplest one. Make more of the same. Give people exactly what they already love. Don't take unnecessary risks. After the extraordinary success of Final Fantasy VII, Square had every reason to play it safe. Instead, it did the exact opposite. While millions of players still hadn't finished Cloud's journey, another project was quietly taking shape inside the studio. It wasn't set in a medieval kingdom, there were no airships drifting across fantasy skies or crystal-powered worlds waiting to be saved. The story unfolded beneath the lights of modern-day New York, where the opening act wasn't a battle on a distinct continent, but an evening at the opera. Then the audience burst into flames. It's one of those opening sequences that stays with you, not because it's shocking for the sake of it, but because it immediately tells you this isn't another traditional role-playing game. The horror feels grounded, the setting feels familiar, the danger isn't waiting inside an ancient castle, it's standing beside ordinary people in an ordinary city that suddenly becomes anything but. At the centre of all of this is Aya Brea, a New York police officer who finds herself caught in the events that seem to ignore every rule of science and reason. Unlike many role-playing heroes of the era, she isn't searching for destiny or prophecy, she's trying to understand what's happening before the world slips even further beyond explanation. That made Parasite Eve feel unusual from the very beginning. Square blended role-playing progression with real-time movement, allowing battles to unfold in a way that felt more immediate than the menu-driven adventures many players associated with the genre. Positioning mattered, timing mattered, the tension of survival horror never disappeared simply because the combat had begun. Instead, both ideas quietly complemented one another, creating something that felt neither entirely like an RPG nor entirely like survival horror, just its own thing. Visually, it carried the same confidence that defined so much of 1998. Cinematic camera work, detailed character models, and dramatic lighting gave New York a sense of place rarely seen on the original PlayStation. The city didn't feel like a backdrop, it felt lived in, gradually becoming stranger than the mystery unfolding around it. Perhaps that's what makes Parasite Eve so memorable. It never seemed interested in fitting neatly into a genre. It borrows ideas from horror, role-playing games, science fiction and cinema, and quietly stitched them together into something that felt unmistakably square while refusing to resemble Final Fantasy. And that says something important about the studio itself. Success hadn't made Square cautious, it made the company fearless. While one team was experimenting with modern horror in Parasite Eve, another was creating the vast philosophic world of Xenogears, a role-playing game whose ambition often reached far beyond what the hardware could comfortably contain. Elsewhere, brave fencer Masashi approached adventure with humour and charm, proving the studio was just as comfortable making something light-hearted as it was tackling darker themes. 3 completely different games, 3 completely different ideas, one remarkably confident developer. Looking back, it's easy to remember Square for Final Fantasy VII, but 1998 reveals something even more interesting. The studio wasn't chasing another phenomenon, it was chasing new ideas. Some became classics, some became cult favourites. All of them reflected a company that believed success wasn't a destination, it was permission to experiment. And by the end of 1998, it wasn't just Square thinking that way. Across the PlayStation, developers were discovering that the audience was willing to follow them somewhere unexpected. The challenge now wasn't finding great games, it was understanding how so many of them had become possible on the same little grey console.
Tekken 伝説 Final Fantasy そして
Xenogears.
One of the strangest things about the PlayStation is that most of the greatest achievements were almost completely invisible. Nobody walked out of a game shop talking about memory management, nobody explicitly explained level of detail systems to their friends in the playground, nobody went home amazed by clever streaming technology. Players talked about moments, the developers made sure of that. Take the doors in Resident Evil 2, the first time you played, they built tension, you'd watch them creak open, wondering what nightmare waited on the other side. Every door became another chance for your imagination to race ahead of you. Only years later did many players realise those moments were quietly disguising the time the PlayStation needed to prepare the next room. A technical necessity had been transformed into one of the game's defining features. It wasn't the only illusion hiding in plain sight. By the time players arrived at Shadow Moses in Metal Gear Solid, Hideo Kojima's team had become masters of directing attention. Corridors twisted out of sight before the hardware ever needed to reveal what lay beyond them. Camera angles lingered exactly where they should, revealing only the parts of the environment that mattered while allowing your imagination to complete the rest. The result wasn't a world that was physically enormous, it simply felt enormous. Then there was Spyro the Dragon. Standing at the edge of a cliff and looking across the floating islands, distant towers and rolling hills felt almost impossible on the original PlayStation. Insomniac's programmers found ingenious ways to simplify distant scenery without the players noticing, creating landscapes that appeared to stretch far beyond the console's limits. You weren't thinking about the technology while standing there, you were deciding which direction to explore first. Even Driver relied on the same philosophy. Its cities only needed to exist there while you were actually driving. Streets appeared seamlessly ahead, while those behind quietly disappeared from memory, creating the illusion of one continuous urban landscape. Players didn't stop to admire the streaming system underneath it all, they simply believed they were speeding through a living city. Perhaps that's what separated the best PlayStation developers by 1998. They stopped asking how to show players impressive technology, they started asking how to stop players noticing it altogether. Every compromise became another opportunity for creativity. Clever camera placements replaced brute force, lighting created atmosphere where extra detail couldn't, sound effects suggested activity beyond the edge of the screen, music filled empty spaces with emotion. The limitations never vanished, they just became part of the performance. That's easy to forget now. Modern hardware often overwhelms through sheer power, but the original PlayStation rarely had that luxury. It demanded inventiveness instead. Every studio approached the challenge differently, yet the goal was always the same: keep the player thinking about the adventure, never the machine running it. Maybe that's why these games have aged so gracefully. Yeah, you can see the wobbling textures, you can spot the rough edges, you notice the short draw distance, but somehow those flaws feel strangely unimportant because the ideas behind them remain just as clever as they were in 1998. The greatest trick PlayStation developers ever pulled wasn't convincing people the console was more powerful than it really was, it was convincing millions of players to forget there was a console there at all. And once developers had mastered that illusion, they could start chasing something even bigger. Not just worlds that felt believable, worlds that felt free.
Come meet me at the Electric Lady Lounge on Ocean.
Do something! We got a tail!
Driver, corruption and betrayal ignite in the adrenaline-charged chase of an era. Grab it now on PlayStation.
Man, don't be a driver.
PlayStation.
Some games tell you exactly where to go. Driver handed you the keys and trusted you to figure it out. Before you even left the garage though, it had one challenge waiting. For countless players, the hardest part of Driver wasn't escaping the police or outrunning gangsters. It wasn't weaving through traffic at impossible speeds or surviving another Hollywood-inspired chase. It was a quiet underground parking garage where a list of driving manoeuvres had to be completed before the timer reached zero. Slaloms, reverse 180s, burnouts, handbrake turns. For many people, the tutorial became the first boss fight, and more than a few never made it any further. Those who did discovered something remarkable. The missions were exciting enough, borrowing the language of car chase films instead of traditional racing games. You weren't competing for first place, you were slipping through the busy streets, avoiding roadblocks, tailing suspects and escaping the police, with every near miss making your heart beat a little faster. Reflections had clearly spent years studying cinema, and it showed. Every pursuit felt like it belonged in Bullet, The French Connection or The Driver, rather than on a starting grid. Yet what many players remember most isn't a mission at all. It's ignoring them. Cruising through San Francisco just to see where the road went, turning down side streets that had nothing waiting at the end, seeing how long you could survive with half the police force chasing you through traffic. There was a quiet thrill in realising the city wasn't simply a backdrop between objectives. It felt like somewhere you could exist, even if it was only for a few minutes before another patrol car spotted you. That feeling was surprisingly rare in 1998. The PlayStation had offered large worlds before, but they were usually built around levels, hubs, or carefully guided progression. Driver suggested something different, a city that seemed to continue beyond the mission itself, where the simple act of driving could be entertaining enough on its own. Of course, that illusion depended on remarkable craftsmanship. The streets ahead streamed into view while those behind quietly disappeared. Buildings that looked solid from a distance often existed only as convincing scenery. Every compromise happened out of sight, allowing players to believe the city carried on forever. Most never questioned how it worked, they simply accepted the freedom it offered. Perhaps that's why Driver left such a lasting impression. It wasn't trying to become a racing game, it wasn't trying to become an action game. It quietly borrowed from pieces of both, then built something that felt entirely on its own. Years later, when open world driving became one of gaming's defining ideas, it became easy to forget how unusual that feeling had once been. Long before sprawling city sandboxes became expected, Driver had already captured one simple pleasure. Sometimes the destination didn't matter, the drive itself was enough. And while players were discovering new ways to explore virtual cities, another ritual was unfolding away from the television. Every 4 weeks, another magazine generation would arrive on the shelf, promising a glimpse of everything that was still to come.
Welcome to the pizza-powered PlayStation giveaway. Grab that scratch and win card that comes with this CD and scratch away because you can win some very cool stuff, including PlayStation game consoles, video games, and a grand prize of $200,000. So give it a shot.
Long before downloadable demos, live streams or trailers appearing instantly online, the future often arrived on a silver disc. For PlayStation owners, demo discs became an experience all of their own. They weren't simply advertisements, they were collections. Little snapshots of the industry at a particular moment in time, filled with games you already loved, games you'd never heard of, and sometimes games that wouldn't arrive for months. However you got hold of one, whether through official UK PlayStation magazine, a promotional bundle, or another special release, slipping a new demo disc into the console always carried a sense of excitement. You never quite knew what was waiting. Sometimes it was only a single level, sometimes just a few minutes. Some demos ended almost as soon as they became interesting, leaving you desperate for the full game. Others became so familiar that you knew every enemy, every shortcut, and every hidden corner by heart. When there was another new game waiting on the shelf, those demos often became the game. Some discs became legendary. One month you may find yourself exploring the opening section of MediEvil, another gave you the first chance to race through Crash Bandicoot Warped. Then came unforgettable previews of games like Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo, Driver, Tombi, and countless others. Entire afternoons disappeared, replaying tiny slices of adventures that were still months away from release. For many players, those first 15 or 20 minutes became inseparable from the games themselves. Sometimes the demo changed everything. A game you'd never considered buying suddenly became one that you couldn't stop thinking about. Other times you discovered a favourite series completely by accident, simply because it happened to be included alongside something else you actually wanted to play. The PlayStation library grew so quickly that demo discs became the easiest way to stumble across something unexpected. Of course, that never stopped people searching for more. Invisible walls became innovations rather than barriers. Players tried to climb onto rooftops that clearly weren't meant to be reached, hunted for hidden menus, tested every button combination they could imagine, and convinced themselves there had to be one final secret the developers had forgotten to remove. Entire playground conversations grew out of trying to break a demo that had been carefully designed to stop after 10 minutes. The discs themselves had personalities too. stylized menus, music that instantly transported you back to a particular year, developer interviews, hidden videos, making of featurettes, cheat sections, save files. Some even hid little surprises that only most curious players would ever discover. They weren't simply launches for demos, they became little time capsules of the PlayStation era. Then there were the rumours. Somebody always claimed that there was a hidden level nobody had found yet. Another swore the timer could be bypassed if you completed the stage in a particular way. And somehow, despite years of disappointment, the mythical Lara Croft nude code continued to survive every new issue, every new demo, and every new conversation. Half the fun wasn't proving the stories were true, it was wondering if this time they finally might be. Perhaps that's why demo discs are remembered so fondly today. Not because they contained complete games, because they encouraged curiosity. They invited players to experiment, to replay, to search every corner and to imagine what the full adventure might eventually become. In an era before instant access, those tiny little previews transformed waiting into part of the experience itself. Years later, many people have forgotten the magazine the disc arrived with. They've forgotten the review scores, they've forgotten the release dates, but they still remember that silver disc spinning inside the PlayStation, offering a glimpse of worlds that felt impossibly exciting. Sometimes the demo became just as memorable as the game itself.
It's an extremely sensitive covert operation. You'll be one man against an entire squad of high-tech special ops. If you want to survive, you gotta have brains. You have to be in peak physical condition. The fate of the free world is in your hands, soldier. Failure is not an option.
Sir, aren't these tests kind of easy?
Suicide mission.
Oh.
Metal Gear Solid.
PlayStation.
By 1998, the PlayStation had stopped feeling like a special occasion. It became part of the day. School finished, work ended, dinner disappeared from the plate. Somewhere in the house, the familiar click of the power button echoed through the room, followed by the soft whir of the disk drive as another evening quietly began. Nobody announced they were going on an adventure. They were just going upstairs for an hour. Sometimes that hour became free. The remarkable thing about the PlayStation library by this point wasn't simply how many great games it offered, it was how naturally they slipped into everyday life. One evening might have been spent trying to shave another second from a Crash Bandicoot Warp Time trial. The next might disappear into Parasite Eve, where another save point always seemed just a little further ahead. Perhaps you only had time for a handful of matches in Tekken 3, or one more attempt at escaping the police in Driver before bed. Every game found its own place in the week. The memory card quietly became a diary without anyone thinking of it that way. Every save file marked another evening, another boss defeated, another level explored. Sometimes you would scroll through old saves and remember exactly where you'd been when you made them. A rainy Saturday, the first weekend of the school holidays, a late night when you'd promised yourself you'd stop after the next checkpoint and somehow watch midnight drift into 1 o'clock instead. Progress no longer disappeared when the television switched off. It waited, patiently, ready for tomorrow. That changed the relationship people had with games. They stopped feeling like something you rented for a weekend or borrowed from a friend before moving on to the next release. They became places you returned to, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. Unlockables encouraged another playthrough, hidden characters tempted you back, better rankings, faster times and alternate endings quietly gave every game another reason to stay inside the console a little longer. Without really noticing, players started building routines around them. There was the game you played when you wanted to relax, there was the one you only tackled when you had a full evening free, the one you promised yourself you'd finally finish this weekend, the one that somehow never left the console for months. Looking back, that's one of the biggest differences between 1998 and the years before. Owning a PlayStation no longer felt like collecting games, it felt like collecting experiences. Each disc carried its own memories, not because somebody told you they were important, but because they quietly became woven into ordinary life. The game stopped interrupting the week, they became part of it. That's probably why this era feels so personal to so many people. Ask someone about 1998 and they rarely begin with review scores or sales figures. They remember where the console sat, the chair they always used, the sound of the startup screen late at night when everyone else had already gone to bed, the game that refused to leave the disc tray. Because by now, the PlayStation wasn't simply where people escaped to, it was beginning to feel like home, and once games become part of your daily routine, the smallest changes begin to matter. A controller that vibrates, an analog stick that feels more natural, tiny details that slowly become impossible to imagine living without. Some of the best parts of gaming happened after you switched off the console. The television was dark, the controller had been put away, somewhere inside the PlayStation, the disc had stopped spinning, yet somehow that was often when the game really began to live. The next morning, somebody would ask a question, "Have you got to that bit yet?" No explanation needed. If you'd been playing the same game, you already knew exactly what they meant. If you hadn't, the conversation usually ended with a promise not to spoil anything, before immediately spoiling just enough to make you desperate to get home and continue. By 1998, those conversations had become part of everyday life. They happened in school corridors while everybody waited for the first lesson. They drifted across the lunch tables at work. They filled bus journeys, weekend football matches and the walk home after another visit to the local game shop. It didn't matter whether someone was 12 or 25, everyone seemed to have discovered something worth talking about. One person couldn't stop telling everyone about the impossible boss they had finally beaten. Another insisted there was a hidden character nobody else had unlocked yet. Somebody else was convinced they had found a shortcut that no magazine had mentioned. Sometimes they were right, often they weren't. That hardly mattered. Half the excitement came from chasing stories that might not even be true. Without walkthrough videos or social media feeding everyone the same discoveries at the same time, every player experienced games a little differently. One friend reached the ending weeks before everyone else, another became obsessed with finding every secret, someone else spent an entire month mastering a single fighting game, while another disappeared into a role-playing adventure that seemed too enormous to ever finish. Nobody experienced 1998 in quite the same way, and that's what made talking about it so enjoyable. Recommendations carried real weight too. You didn't have hundreds of opinions waiting online before spending your money. Sometimes all you had was one trusted friend saying, "You have to play this," that was enough. A single conversation could decide what game you save for next, what you rented at the weekend, or what ended up on your birthday list months later. Those conversations rarely stayed focused for long. Someone would begin by talking about Metal Gear Solid, only for another person to interrupt with a story about finally escaping the police and driver. A debate about Tekken 3 would somehow end up with everyone arguing over which PlayStation soundtrack was the best. Every memory seemed to lead naturally into another, until nobody could quite remember how the discussion had started. Looking back, that's one of the things that made 1998 feel so special. The PlayStation wasn't simply giving people games, it was giving them something to share. Not screenshots, not clips, stories. Stories that grew slightly larger every time they were retold. Stories that survived long after the memory cards had been packed away and the discs had found their way back into the cases. Stories that still appear today whenever old friends meet and somebody casually says, "Do you remember?" Because the games themselves were only part of the experience, the conversations became part of the memory too, and for millions of people, those memories quietly settled into the rhythm of everyday life, where one kind of game returned week after next, season after season, becoming as familiar as Saturday afternoon itself.
So where were you?
I took a TVR Cerebra.
Rammed a Nissan Skyline and a Toyota Supra.
Yes!
There's no record of any of that.
Do you want to change your story?
Not every PlayStation game was built around reaching the ending. Some were simply built to become part of your week. Long after the credits had rolled on the year's biggest adventures, there was always a handful of discs that never seemed to leave the console. They weren't waiting for the perfect evening or an uninterrupted weekend. They were the games you reach for almost without thinking, filling an hour before dinner, a rainy Sunday afternoon, or those moments when friends drop by unexpectedly. By 1998, sports games had quietly become part of everyday routine. Football arrived with the same comforting feeling as the real season itself. New squads, new kits, new commentary. Every autumn brought another excuse to start again, and whether you preferred the fast arcade feel of FIFA Road to World Cup 98 or the thoughtful passion of movement of ISS Pro 98, those rivalries often became just as passionate about the matches taking place on the television. Entire evenings disappeared into tournaments where nobody wanted to be the first person knocked out. Away from the football pitch, Colin McRae Rally captured a completely different kind of competition. There were no rival cars crowding every corner, only a stopwatch, a co-driver, and a constant temptation to push just a little harder. Success came from trust just as much as speed, listening to every instruction while gravel, mud and tarmac blared underneath the wheels. Every stage demanded concentration, and every mistake lingered far longer than it would in a traditional racing game. It wasn't about spectacular crashes, it was about precision. Meanwhile, games like Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit embraced the opposite philosophy. Here, the joy came from speed, exotic cars, and the thrill of seeing flashing lights appear in the mirror. Escaping the police became just as satisfying as crossing the finish line, turning every race into a miniature action film where getting caught felt just as memorable as winning. Perhaps that's what united these games. They didn't ask players to save the world, they simply asked them to play one more match, one more rally stage, one more race. The objectives were familiar, but that familiarity became part of the appeal. You always knew what the next session would look like, even if the result was never guaranteed. Winning still mattered, but so did the ritual itself. Loading your favourite team, choosing your car, handing the second controller to whoever happened to be sitting beside you, they were the kind of games that quietly fitted around everyday life rather than demanding all your attention. Looking back, it's easy to overlook how important those routines became. The biggest blockbusters shaped memories, but sports games shaped habits. They were always there between the major releases, filling the weeks before Christmas, carrying players through long school holidays, and bringing people back to the PlayStation long after the latest adventure had been completed. Their stories weren't written by developers, they were written by the people playing them. The impossible comeback in the final minute, the rally stage finally completed without mistake, the race won by inches after 20 minutes of perfect concentration, small victories repeated hundreds of times. By the end of 1998, the PlayStation had become many things to many people. For some, it was a place to lose themselves in unforgettable stories. For others, it was simply where Saturday afternoons began. And while millions were settling comfortably into those familiar routines, the rest of the gaming world wasn't standing still. Beyond the PlayStation, another generation was already beginning to take shape.
本当かい？
はい、すぐ変わりました。変わった変わった。
そうか。
セガが一番面白いよ。
いや、おじさんホッとしたよ。
嘘だよ。セガなんていらないよ。いらないいらない。帰ってプレステやろう。やらない。
おい、待ってくれ。
専務大丈夫ですか？
あ、はあ。お、爪が折れちゃった。
立つんだ。湯川専務。
For all the confidence surrounding the PlayStation in 1998, the rest of the industry hadn't stopped moving. If anything, it was moving faster than ever. This wasn't a year where one console stood alone while everyone else waited patiently for another chance. New ideas were appearing from every direction, each one hinting that video games were growing into something far bigger than anyone had imagined only a few years earlier. The PlayStation may have been the centre of the momentum, but it certainly wasn't the whole story. On PC, Half-Life quietly rewrote expectations of what a first-person shooter could be. Rather than interrupting the action with lengthy cutscenes, Valve allowed the story to unfold around the player. Scientists hurried through corridors, security guards fought desperately to survive. The Black Mesa research facility felt like a place that continued to exist, whether Gordon Freeman was standing there or not. It was a different approach to storytelling, one that would influence countless games in the years that followed. Across the industry, Nintendo delivered one of its own moments with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It wasn't important because it competed directly with the PlayStation. Most players already knew which console sat beneath the television. What mattered was something much broader. Another developer had shown just how ambitious three-dimensional adventures could become. Whether you were exploring Hyrule or Shadow Moses, it was becoming increasingly clear that video games had entered a new creative era. Elsewhere, an entirely different phenomenon was quietly taking shape. Pokemon had already transformed into a cultural obsession in Japan before sweeping across Europe and North America with remarkable speed. Television, trading cards, playground conversations and handheld gaming suddenly merged into something that felt impossible to escape. Even people who never touched the Game Boy probably knew the names Pikachu or Charizard by the end of the year. Meanwhile, another machine was waiting patiently just beyond the horizon. In Japan, Sega launched the Dreamcast, introducing new hardware that hinted where the industry would travel next. Online ideas, cleaner visuals and fresh possibilities were beginning to emerge, even if much of the world would have to wait another year before seeing them for themselves. The next generation no longer felt like a distant rumour, it had already begun. Looking back now, that's what makes 1998 so remarkable. It wasn't simply packed with great games, it was filled with possibility. Developers were becoming more confident, budgets were growing, stories were becoming more ambitious, new genres were finding their audience, while established ones continued to evolve into unexpected directions. It felt as though every month revealed another idea that nobody had quite imagined before. The PlayStation happened to be standing in the centre of the creative explosion, but the excitement reached far beyond a single console. Wherever players chose to spend their time, the industry itself seemed determined to push things further than it ever had before. Without anyone quite realising it, gaming was preparing to leave the 1990s behind. A new generation of hardware was approaching, new ideas were arriving almost faster than people could play them. And after a year like 1998, one question quietly hung over the entire industry: how could anyone possibly follow it?
Sega's errors as a company, though, have been well documented. Its last home console flopped, and it's seen its market share plummet from more than 50% to about 1%. Can Dreamcast end Sega's nightmare?
They have a lot banking on the Dreamcast. Again, they're a leap. It's sort of a leap in video game technology, and Sega's going to use this to make a comeback into the marketplace.
The $199 Dreamcast comes with a built-in modem, making it the first set built for online gaming. 18 games will be available right away. You can fight, fish, or skateboard. There's also a much-anticipated football game, NFL Y2K.
Which, to quote all the media today, is saying this is by far the best sports simulator ever brought to gaming.
Sonic will have to run pretty fast to catch Nintendo and Sony, but Sega's off to a good start there, having already pre-sold 300,000 of the Dreamcast consoles. The company hopes to sell 1 million units by Christmas. Rick Lockridge, CNN, Los Angeles.
For many people, 1998 isn't remembered as a collection of release dates, it's remembered as Christmas morning. Long before the presents appeared beneath the tree, the excitement had already been building for weeks. Every trip into town became another excuse to stop outside Game, Electronics Boutique or HMV for just a few minutes longer than necessary. Argos catalogues slowly filled with folded pages and circles drawn around impossible wish lists. Magazine previews had already been read so many times that some of the corners had begun to curl. The waiting became part of the experience. Then somehow, it was finally Christmas. The house felt different before anyone had even opened a present. There was the sound of relatives arriving, breakfast being prepared somewhere downstairs, and wrapping paper already beginning to gather across the carpet. Yet for plenty of PlayStation owners, there was always one small box that seemed to matter just a little more than the others. Games were expensive, you didn't expect a new one every week. Sometimes this was the only brand new adventure you'd receive for months, which made choosing it feel incredibly important. By the time you finally held it in your hands, you'd probably already memorised the screenshots on the back of the case and read every preview you could find. Now, at last, it belonged to you. There was never any rush to put the disc straight into the console. First came the ritual. Peeling away the cellophane as carefully as possible, opening the jewel case for the very first time, flicking through the instruction manual while everyone else was still opening presents, studying character artwork, controls and tiny screenshots that somehow made the adventure feel even bigger. The game hadn't even started yet, but in your mind, you were already there. Eventually, the moment arrived. the PlayStation clicked into life, the familiar startup echoed through the room. For a second, nothing else seemed to exist. Outside, Christmas Day carried on as normal. Family chatted in the next room. Dinner slowly came together in the kitchen. Somebody reminded you not to disappear upstairs all afternoon. Just 1 hour. It was almost never 1 hour. Those first moments with a new game were unlike anything that followed. Every menu felt unfamiliar. Every level carried the excitement of a genuine discovery. You had no idea what waited around the next corner because nobody had uploaded the engine before release. Secrets stayed secrets. Twists remained surprises. Every breakthrough belonged entirely to you. Perhaps that's why these tiny moments lasted so long, not because every game became a masterpiece, but because every game represented possibility, a whole new world waiting inside a single jewel case. And looking back now, it's remarkable how little it took to create memories that would stay with people for decades. A humming CRT television, a controller that still felt brand new in your hands, wrapping paper pushed into the corner of the room, an instruction manual lying open beside you, the winter light beginning to fade outside while you quietly promised yourself you'd stop playing after the next level. You rarely did. For a few precious days, the outside world seemed to slow down. School was still weeks away. Work could wait. The clock hardly mattered. There was simply time to play. And perhaps that's why so many people still look back at Christmas 1998 with such affection. Not because it was perfect, because for a little while it felt like anything was possible. Of course, moments like that never last forever. When the decorations eventually came down and the new year quietly arrived, the PlayStation found itself facing something it never experienced before: expectation. Success changes everything. When you're chasing the market leader, every great game feels like a victory. Every surprise catches people off guard because nobody expected it to happen in the first place. Remaining at the top is different. By the time Christmas decorations had been packed away and players slowly returned to school, work and everyday routines, the PlayStation was no longer the ambitious newcomer trying to prove itself. That story belonged in the past. Now it carried a different kind of burden. People expected greatness, not eventuality. Every single time they picked up a controller, it was a remarkable position to find yourself in. Over the previous 12 months, players had escaped Raccoon City, crept through Shadow Moses, explored worlds with dragons, perfected impossible fighting game combos, and discovered adventures that nobody could have predicted only a few years earlier. The PlayStation library had become so consistently strong that extraordinary games no longer felt extraordinary, they felt expected. That quiet shift mattered. Developers weren't simply trying to make good games anymore. They were trying to follow years that had already raised the standard for everyone else. Sequels faced impossible comparisons before they had even been announced. New ideas competed against memories that players already considered classics. Every studio understood that audiences weren't hoping for something special. They assumed it. Perhaps that was the greatest compliment the PlayStation could receive. Players trusted it. Buying a PlayStation game increasingly felt less like taking a gamble and more like discovering what surprise waited next. That confidence had been earned over years of remarkable creativity, but maintaining it would prove far harder than building it in the first place. The industry itself wasn't standing still either. Development teams were growing larger, ambitions continued to rise, new hardware was beginning to appear on the horizon, promising cleaner graphics, bigger worlds and fresh possibilities. The expectations surrounding video games were changing almost as quickly as the technology itself. Standing still was no longer an option. Yet despite all that pressure, there was remarkably little sense that the PlayStation had reached the end of its story. If anything, the opposite was true. Konami was preparing another journey into horror. A skateboarding game from an unlikely collaboration was quietly gathering momentum behind the scenes. Entire genres were still waiting for their defining moments. Nobody knew exactly what 1999 would bring. They only knew one thing. After a year like 1998, simply being good would never feel good enough again. That may have been the PlayStation's greatest achievement, not creating impossible expectations, inspiring an industry that genuinely wanted to meet them, and somehow, against all reasonable odds, the story was only just getting started. Years are usually remembered for one or two moments, one great game, one unforgettable console, one breakthrough that somehow comes to define everything that followed. 1998 refused to be remembered that way. It wasn't built around a single masterpiece or one defining release. Instead, it became something far rarer, a year where almost every month seemed to deliver another reason to fall in love with video games all over again. Horror, stealth, racing, fighting games, role-playing adventures, platformers, sports games, and ideas nobody could quite fit into a single genre all found their place on the same little grey console. Looking back now, it's tempting to ask whether 1998 was the greatest year in PlayStation history. Perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe what made it special wasn't that every game was perfect, it was that every player remembers a different one. Ask 10 people about 1998 and you'll probably hear 10 different answers. One will immediately think of escaping Raccoon City, another remembers mastering impossible combos in Tekken 3, someone else still hears the footsteps echoing through Shadow Moses or remembers soaring across Spyro's peaceful landscapes for the very first time. Others spent endless evenings behind the wheel, chasing one more victory, one more lap, one more high score. No single game defines the year, together they do. Perhaps that's why people continue returning to this period, even decades later, not simply to replay old favourites, but to revisit a moment when it felt as though anything was possible. Developers weren't following formulas, they were inventing them. Studios were confident enough to experiment, publishers were willing to take chances, and players rewarded that ambition with curiosity instead of caution. The PlayStation had become far more than a successful console, it had become a place where creativity seemed to flourish. Yet history has a habit of refusing to stand still. As remarkable as 1998 had been, change was already gathering on the horizon. Sega's new machine was preparing for a worldwide launch. A quiet horror project called Silent Hill was beginning to emerge from Konami. Somewhere else, an unlikely skateboarding game was introducing players to ideas that would soon become another phenomenon. The next chapter wasn't waiting years away. It was already on its way. That's what makes looking back at 1998 so fascinating. It wasn't the end of an era, it was the moment everything seemed to come together. The confidence, the creativity, the technology, the people making games, and the millions of players discovering them. For one extraordinary year, they all moved in the same direction. Maybe that's why the memories feel so vivid, not because the graphics were better than anyone else's, not because every idea succeeded, because this was the year the PlayStation stopped feeling like the future. It simply became part of people's lives, and somehow, even after everything you'd seen this year, the story is only just getting started, because 1999 wasn't about trying to live up to 1998, it was about proving lightning could strike twice. If you've enjoyed the journey through 1998, I'd really appreciate you leaving a like. It genuinely helps more people discover the series and lets me know you're enjoying these deep dives into PlayStation history. If you're new here and you'd like to experience the complete story, consider subscribing and follow the playlist below. We're exploring every year of the original PlayStation, from its uncertain beginnings at the early 90s all the way through its final years in 2006. Every episode builds onto the last and the best is still to come. And finally, a huge thank you goes out to all the channel members. Your support helps make a project like this possible, and I honestly couldn't create these documentaries without you. Until next time, I've been Parasite. Thanks for watching. The history continues.
That'll pump up a team.
PlayStation